Now, Michael Jackson's death has been surrounded by conspiracy theories for over 16 years, but the strange part is you don't even need a conspiracy theory to find this story disturbing, because the official version is already hard enough to process. Michael Jackson wasn't found in some hospital room. He wasn't surrounded by a full medical team. He wasn't under anesthesia for surgery. He was inside his own bedroom. And the drug at the center of everything wasn't a regular sleeping pill. It was propofol, a powerful anesthetic, usually used in medical settings, known as the milk of anesthesia in the medical world. Michael referred to it as milk. And according to Conrad Murray, Michael Jackson's personal physician, it was the one thing Michael believed could finally put him to sleep. But that was only one side of the story, because one day Michael Jackson was preparing for one of the biggest comebacks in music history, and the next day, the world found out he was gone. And when the 911 call was made from Michael's home, one of the most chilling details was that the caller told dispatch the doctor was the only person there with him. So if Michael Jackson had a doctor right there with him, how did this even happen? This video isn't about proving some wild conspiracy. It's about the official findings, testimony, and reporting surrounding how Michael Jackson died, and why even after all these years, the whole thing still never really made sense. Michael Jackson, the king of pop. By 2009, he was preparing for This Is It, a 50-show concert residency scheduled to take place at the O2 Arena in London. The first show was set for July 13, 2009, which meant that by the final week of June, rehearsals were already in their final stretch. But according to people involved in the production, there were concerns behind the scenes. On June 19th, Michael Jackson showed up to rehearsals, but his condition raised concern among the people around him. The next day, a meeting was held at his home to discuss what had happened and whether he was ready to continue. After that, rehearsals continued, and June 24th, Michael was back working on a show. Footage from those final rehearsals will later become part of the documentary, Michael Jackson's This Is It. So before everything happened, Michael Jackson's final week was a mix of preparation, pressure, and concern, with one of the biggest comebacks in music history still moving forward, or at least that's what was supposed to happen. But behind that comeback, there was another problem happening in private. According to Murray and later testimony, Michael Jackson just couldn't sleep. And that might sound simple at first because a lot of people struggle with sleep. I'm kind of going through it with sleep right now myself. But keep in mind, this wasn't happening in like a normal session of his life. He was weeks away from a massive comeback. Rehearsals were intensifying, and according to Murray's version, Michael felt like if he didn't sleep, he couldn't function. Makes a lot of sense. Now, in Michael's case, the sleep problem had gone way beyond normal insomnia. He just wasn't able to sleep, like he had so many issues with it. But before we get into what was being used to help Michael sleep, we have to talk about Conrad Murray. Because Conrad Murray wasn't just a doctor who randomly appeared in Michael Jackson's bedroom on June 25th, 2009. According to Murray's version, he first met Michael back in 2006, years before This Is It was supposed to happen. At the time, Murray was a cardiologist with practices in Las Vegas and Houston, Texas. And according to Murray, the connection started through one of his patient's sons, a man he described as Michael's security guard, who referred him when Michael and his children were dealing with what Murray called a family flu illness. So at first, Murray wasn't this full-time doctor living inside Michael's world. He was just a physician Michael had been referred to during a health situation in Las Vegas. But over time, that relationship grew into something much more personal. By 2009, when Michael was preparing for This Is It, Murray wasn't just some outside physician Michael visited once in a while. According to Murray's interview, by the final stretch, he said he was spending every night at Michael's house except Sundays, at Michael's request. Michael apparently wanted Murray to come with him to London for the concert run, and the arrangement being discussed would have paid Murray $150,000 a month. Pretty good money, right? Now, once you understand that, you start seeing the relationship differently. So this wasn't just a normal doctor-patient situation anymore. Michael was preparing for one of the biggest comebacks in music history and of his life. There was a lot of money and resources invested in this entire thing. Fans around the world were waiting, and Murray was being placed in a position where his job was basically to keep Michael functioning through all of it. Now, to be fair, Michael reportedly trusted Murray, and that trust is of course important, because when somebody's struggling with something as personal as sleep, they're not just looking for a prescription. They're looking for somebody they believe understands them. But that's also where the situation becomes dangerous. Because when a doctor becomes that close to a patient, especially a patient as powerful, isolated, and pressured as Michael Jackson, the line between medical care and personal service can start to blur. And in this case, the thing at the center of that blurred line was sleep. So let me paint the picture for you, okay? Michael was in the final stretch of rehearsing for This Is It. This was supposed to be his big return, 50 shows in London, a massive production, fans were waiting, money on the line, all that stuff, right? So there was a whole machine moving around him. And in the middle of all that, his sleep issues became like just really bad. Now, this is something Michael had reportedly struggled with before. Sleep had been an issue for him, especially after performances and during intense work periods. So this wasn't a situation where it's like a one random night, he can't fall asleep. It had been like a real problem in his life before. But by the time he was preparing for This Is It, that problem wasn't being treated like regular insomnia anymore. It was becoming one of the most frustrating parts of his life. Because when you're rehearsing for one of the biggest comebacks in music history, sleep isn't just sleep. Sleep is recovery. Sleep is energy. Sleep is the thing that determines whether you can show up the next day and perform or not. And according to Conrad Murray's version of events, Michael felt that pressure. Fast forward to June 2009. Michael spends the day rehearsing for This Is It. And from the outside looking in, things seemed like they were moving forward. He was back at rehearsal, the show was still coming together, the comeback was still alive. But after rehearsal ended and Michael returned home, the private side of the story started. According to Murray, Michael got home shortly after 1 a.m. in the morning. He showered, got settled, and then the same problem was waiting for him. He was exhausted, but he couldn't sleep. And from that point on, Murray's version is that the night turned into hours of him trying to get Michael to rest. According to him, he tried giving Michael milder sedatives through the night before resorting to propofol. In the recorded police interview, Murray described giving Michael things like Valium, lorazepam, and midazolam at different points through the night. But according to him, Michael remained awake and kept complaining that he needed sleep. And that detail is important, because in Murray's version, this wasn't a situation where Michael couldn't sleep and immediately jumped to the strongest thing possible. According to what Conrad was saying, multiple medications had already been tried throughout the night, and Michael still wasn't sleeping. So by the morning, the situation had escalated. By around 10 a.m., according to Murray, Michael asked for propofol, the white anesthetic he referred to as milk. Murray said Michael asked, please, give me some milk so that I can sleep, because it was all that really works for him. And when Conrad Murray brought up rehearsals, he claimed Michael told him, just make me sleep, doesn't matter what time I get up. He also claimed Michael said he couldn't function if he didn't sleep. So if Conrad's version is true, Michael wasn't describing this like something casual. He was describing desperation. He was describing a need to finally shut down and sleep. But that's exactly why Murray's role mattered so much. Because here's the thing, a doctor's job, especially like a private one in this type of situation where you can get really close to the patient, a doctor's job is not to just give a patient what they want. A doctor's job is to protect the patient from the thing they're asking for, especially when that thing could kill them. You're there to help this person, not to surrender to their demands. Not to become so close to the patient that your medical judgment starts getting replaced by loyalty, pressure, or fear of saying no. And that's the moment where this case crosses a line. Because propofol is not a normal sleep medication. It's not Ambien, it's not melatonin. It's not something you take because you're stressed and need to rest. Propofol is a powerful anesthetic, usually connected to medical procedures. And according to expert testimony, propofol had no real place being used as sleep aid in a private bedroom without proper safeguards. But according to Conrad Murray, Michael kept asking. He described Michael as persistent. Now again, this is Conrad Murray's version, and that matters. Because later on, prosecutors would challenge the idea that this was just some small controlled dose. But even if you only listen to Murray's own story, the picture is still disturbing. Because the way he framed the night was basically this. He tried to help Michael to sleep. Michael kept asking for propofol. Murray stepped away for a brief moment, and somehow in that short window, Michael ended up not breathing. In other words, Murray's version placed a lot of the pressure back on Michael. Michael wanted the drug, Michael knew about the drug, Michael kept asking for it. And later, the defense would take that even further by suggesting Michael may have administered the fatal dose himself while Murray wasn't in the room. Because even if Michael wanted propofol, even if he begged for it, even if he believed it was the only thing that could finally put him to sleep, Murray was still the doctor. And by the morning of June 25th, Michael Jackson's sleep problem had turned into a medical situation involving IV sedatives, a private bedroom, and a surgical anesthetic. And the comeback wasn't even the most urgent thing anymore. The urgent thing was getting Michael to sleep. So Conrad Murray agreeing to use propofol this way was exactly where the doctor-patient relationship broke down. Because although he was Michael Jackson's personal doctor, his job was not to simply say yes, like be a yes man. His job was to say no when the thing Michael wanted was dangerous. Now some people might hear that and say, well, Michael was the one asking for it, and yes. According to Murray's version, Michael did ask for propofol. He allegedly begged for it. He allegedly believed it was the only thing that worked. But that still doesn't remove the responsibility from the doctor. Because Michael was not the medical professional in that room. He was the patient. He was exhausted. He was desperate for sleep. He was under pressure. So the question is, how clear could Michael's judgment really be in that moment? That's why this argument becomes dangerous when people try to put everything on Michael. because even if Michael wanted the drug, even if he asked for it repeatedly, you're just not supposed to give it to him. Now, one of the biggest issues with Conrad Murray in this entire case and situation is that he didn't have the proper setup. He didn't have the proper safeguards. He didn't have the proper emergency support. And according to someone who testified in this case for the prosecution, like an expert on this drug propofol, he said that the proper safeguards for propofol were not in place. No proper monitoring system, no proper medical records, no proper emergency backup, no hospital setting, no anesthesia level safety around him. Just Michael Jackson, his personal doctor, an IV, and a powerful anesthetic being used for sleep. According to Murray, after giving Michael the propofol, he stayed with him for about 10 minutes. Then he says he stepped away. And Murray claimed he was gone for about 2 minutes, and when he came back, according to him, Michael was no longer breathing. So in Murray's version of events, the entire tragedy happened in an extremely small window of time. He gives Michael propofol, Michael finally falls asleep, Murray steps away, and by the time he returns, the biggest entertainer on earth is unresponsive in his bedroom. But once other people enter that room, the story started looking even more disturbing. According to one of Michael's security guards, Alberto Alvarez, he was sitting in a security trailer outside the home when Michael's assistant, Michael Amir Williams, called him and told him to get inside because Michael wasn't well. When Alvarez entered the room, he said Michael was lying on the bed with his arms outreached, his mouth open, and his eyes open. Murray was allegedly doing chest compressions on Michael while he was still on the bed. And according to Alvarez, Murray said Michael had a bad reaction. And that phrase matters, because according to his bodyguard, his security guard, Murray did not give a detailed explanation in that moment. He allegedly said Michael had a bad reaction. That's all he said, right? Then, according to Alvarez, Murray said they needed to get Michael to a hospital and needed ambulance. But before 911 was called, Alvarez testified that Murray grabbed medical vials from Michael's nightstand and told him to put them in a bag. Alvarez said Murray gave him a similar instruction about an IV bag containing a white milk-like substance, but not a nearby saline bag. And that became a moment the prosecutors later focused on, because if the situation was truly an emergency, the obvious question is why, according to Alvarez's testimony, were medical items being gathered before 911 had even been called? Pretty shady, right? Now later under cross-examination, this came into question, and Alvarez acknowledged that he had not mentioned this detail in the first 2 police interviews, and the defense suggested that Alvarez may have thought Murray was packing things up to go to the hospital. Alvarez agreed that at the time, that may have been what he thought. So we do gotta be, somewhat careful with this part. We can't just say that Murray was definitely hiding evidence as a fact. I don't really know that because I wasn't there. But what we can say is that Alvarez testified that Murray told him to gather the vials and the IV bag before 911 was called, and that in itself is just kind of shady in my opinion. And Murray's movements in those few minutes where all this was happening is a big reason why this case became so disturbing, because this wasn't just a doctor immediately calling emergency services and clearly telling paramedics everything. So Michael was described lying on a bed with his arms outstretched, his mouth open, and his eyes open. And Murray at that point was allegedly doing chest compressions on Michael while Michael was still on a bed with one hand. Now, at some point before or during the emergency response, Michael was moved from the bed to the floor because first responders, under testimony, described paramedics working on him on the bedroom floor. Now, when the paramedics actually arrived, there are more things about Murray's movements at that particular moment that came into question and raised a lot of questions. And much of it was heavily focused on what Murray said and what he didn't say in the moments after Michael stopped breathing. According to the first paramedic on the scene, Murray actually never mentioned anything about propofol at first. Pretty irresponsible, because if Michael is unresponsive in a moment like that, you need to tell the paramedics exactly what's happening, like what happened here. You need to be honest. In the end, they're gonna find this out anyway, right? So he just did not mention anything about propofol. It was almost like that didn't even happen. Instead, he claimed Michael's only issue was dehydration, and he significantly understated how long Michael had been down. And that is a massive detail, because propofol wasn't just some random side note. Propofol was the drug that would later become the center of this entire case. So when emergency help arrived, according to the paramedic, that was not the first thing Murray told them. And one of the paramedics actually testified and said that it just didn't add up. And then there was the timing. Murray at the time was asked how long Michael had been down, and Conrad Murray said it just happened. But based on Michael's condition, including dilated pupils, dry eyes, and skin that was cold to the touch, the medical personnel said he felt this didn't look like something that had just happened. I mean, they're professionals, so they can instantly kind of see when stuff is just not right. And so this is what they said. They just felt like, man, all this stuff that we're seeing right now, it just doesn't add up, right? He believed Michael may have been down for more than 20 minutes. And this is where the situation gets even more uncomfortable. Now we had a timeline problem. Murray's version depended on the idea that everything happened so fast. He gave Michael the propofol. Michael fell asleep. He stepped away for a second, or 2 minutes specifically. He came back. Michael wasn't breathing. But the people who entered that room didn't describe a situation that felt clean or immediate. They kind of were just confused at the situation. They kind of described like a delay. They described a doctor who seemed to be moving between different priorities at the same time. The obvious situation is that when someone is seemingly dying, the first priority should be call 911, get help, tell paramedics everything they need to know. But that's not what Conrad Murray, his personal physician, did. So another detail was that his children were actually close enough to enter the room. Paris and Prince reportedly entered the room and saw their father in that condition. Michael's security guard said one of Michael's children screamed, "Daddy," and Conrad Murray shouted for them to be taken out, saying not to let them see their father like that. So at this point, staff are being pulled in, the children are witnessing it, and the whole time, the clock is ticking. Now, paramedics apparently worked on Michael for 42 minutes, using CPR, drugs, to try to restart his heart, but the heart monitor showed a clean flatline. So at this point, they were trying to literally bring Michael Jackson back to life. And keep in mind, during this whole time, Conrad Murray still had not mentioned propofol to the paramedics. It's crazy how he would let them operate with incomplete information while they're trying to save his life. So everything that was not said in this situation basically affected the outcome here. Now eventually Michael was rushed to UCLA Medical Center. Doctors there continued trying to revive him, but by that point the situation was already desperate. The public would later hear that Michael Jackson died from cardiac arrest, and technically that was true. But cardiac arrest is not the full explanation. That just means the heart stopped. The real question is, why did it stop? And that's where the autopsy becomes important. Because after all the confusion in the bedroom, after Murray's version, after the 911 call, after the paramedics, after the hospital, coroner's office had to answer the question everybody was asking. What actually killed Michael Jackson? And the official answer was not natural causes. It wasn't physical trauma. It wasn't some mysterious illness. According to the coroner's opinion, the manner of death was ruled homicide for several key reasons. The report pointed to propofol and benzodiazepines being administered by another person, propofol being used in a non-hospital setting without an appropriate medical indication, the standard of care not being met, and the absence of recommended equipment for monitoring, precise dosing, and resuscitation. The report also stated that the circumstances did not support self-administration of propofol, which would later clash with the defense theory at trial. So a big part here was just trying to put all the blame on Michael. He self-administered these drugs that killed him, but obviously that's ridiculous, right? Now the focus wasn't just on Michael's health. It was on the medical setup around Michael. How did a man trying to sleep end up being given a surgical anesthetic in his bedroom? And how was the drug being monitored? Why were the proper safeguards not there? And how did the doctor in the room not immediately tell paramedics about the most important drug involved? And this is how this became a criminal case, because prosecutors weren't just saying Michael Jackson died simply because he was fragile. They were saying he died because Conrad Murray failed him as a doctor. And when the trial began, that became the central argument. Michael Jackson did not have to die. And so a big part here was that they focused on the entire setup, or lack thereof, right? An expert testified and talked about the monitoring, the equipment, and everything that was just not there. And this expert said that those safeguards were not in place. So obviously this was not, Michael was given something and then he just had a bad reaction. That's what the defense team was basically trying to rock with. This was really, Michael Jackson was given a very powerful anesthetic in his own bedroom without the kind of safety system that would normally surround that drug. That's very important here. And keep in mind that Murray's version and story here was basically that Michael looked fine, then he stepped away, then he came back, and everything had changed. And another question here became, why did the doctor leave a sedated patient alone? This is why you monitor every second. And this is why you need proper equipment. Because by the time something looks obviously wrong, it might already be too late, and that's dangerous. Now, another thing that's really important here is that Conrad Murray took no medical notes on Michael's treatment that day and did not record his vital signs. So we're talking about the most basic life-sustaining functions here: body temperature, heart rate, respiration rate, and blood pressure. I mean, these are some very fundamental things, and as a doctor, in Conrad Murray's position, how could he not do that? So there are no proper records showing moment by moment what was being done to Michael here. No clean medical chart, no documented vital signs, none of that. No clear record that could explain exactly what happened before everything went wrong. I mean, think about that for a second. That's crazy, isn't it? So when people ask why Michael Jackson's death still feels suspicious, this is part of the reason. It's not just because he died, it's because the care around him looked so casual for something so dangerous. And so that's what prosecutors built their case around. They argue that Murray didn't act like a doctor who was protecting his patient, and the prosecution's expert framed it as a breakdown of the doctor-patient relationship. Murray acted more like Michael's employee than the physician who should have said no. And one of the experts here put it in the simplest way possible. A doctor's job is not to just say yes. A doctor's job is to know when to say no. So even if Michael begged for it, even if Michael believed it was the only thing that could put him to sleep, Murray was still the doctor. He was the person who understood or should have understood the risk. So a big part here wasn't the question about whether Michael Jackson wanted the drug. It was about whether Conrad Murray should have ever given it to him in that environment. And one of the ways Conrad Murray's legal team was basically trying to defend him here is that they were trying to argue that Murray did not give Michael enough propofol to kill him. Their theory was that Michael, desperate for sleep, may have administered the fatal dose himself while Murray was out the room, when really everything here points to the fact that it was gross negligence. So the real question here wasn't whether Michael Jackson self-administered propofol by drinking it. That was one angle the defense explored early on. They even commissioned a study to see what effects propofol would have if it was swallowed orally, but that study ended up hurting that argument more than helping it. Why? Well, it turns out that the effect would have been trivial, meaning even if propofol was swallowed like some milk, it would not explain the fatal result in this case. So they dropped that claim. At that point, they were no longer going to argue that Michael swallowed a fatal dose of propofol, and that matters because propofol is obviously not some regular liquid sleep medicine you drink before bed. It is an anesthetic administered through the bloodstream. So that version of the self-administration theory basically fell apart. The real question was whether he could have realistically administered it through an IV himself while already sedated, exhausted, and supposedly being monitored by his doctor. And so a practical question here was, could Michael really have administered the drug himself in that state? Could he have done it while under the effects of other sedatives? My personal opinion, no, right? It was also demonstrated how propofol is drawn into an IV bag with a syringe, and it was said that the process appeared too complicated for self-administration. So Michael could have possibly not done this. You know, when you strip away the celebrity Michael Jackson, right? Like the celebrity version of him, and just forget Michael Jackson for a second, right? You still have a patient being given a surgical anesthetic in a bedroom, a doctor with no proper records, no proper safety setup, no immediate 911 call, and then no immediate disclosure of propofol to paramedics, and then a chaotic scene where witnesses said medical items were being gathered before emergency services were called. And this is why the prosecution were arguing that Michael Jackson did not have to die here, because he didn't have to die. Not because Michael was perfectly healthy, not because he had no issues, not because he wasn't struggling, but because in their view, the person trusted to care for him failed at the most basic responsibility, protecting the patient from harm. Now, eventually, in the trial, the jury agreed. Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. But even after that conviction, the story never felt fully settled in the public's mind. I know it doesn't in my head, at least. Because legally, the case had an answer. Murray was a doctor held responsible, but emotionally and narratively, the case still felt bigger than that. Because how does the biggest entertainer in the world end up in a bedroom being treated with surgical anesthesia just to sleep? And how does a sleep problem turn into a death investigation? How does a doctor become so close to a patient that the line between medical care and personal service starts to disappear? And how many people around Michael saw warning signs before it was too late? That's why Michael Jackson's death never made sense. Not because there was no official explanation. There was. The official explanation was clear enough to convict his doctor. But the detail around that explanation are what made the story so disturbing. The final rehearsals, the pressure, the insomnia, the propofol, the doctor in the bedroom, the delayed 911 call, the missing disclosure, the vials, the IV bag, the paramedic saying it didn't add up. All of it paints a picture of a man surrounded by people, but still somehow vulnerable in the one moment where he needed real medical protection the most. And by the time the world found out Michael Jackson was gone, the king of pop wasn't on a stage. He wasn't under the lights. He wasn't in front of the fans waiting for his comeback. He was in a bedroom trying to sleep. And that's what makes the story so tragic. Because the thing Michael was chasing in his final hours wasn't fame. It wasn't applause. It wasn't another record. It was rest. The guy just wanted to sleep. And somehow that became the thing that killed him. I've always felt like Michael Jackson's death never truly made sense, but that's just my personal opinion. I'm curious what you guys think. I'm sure you'll have at least something to say about this entire conversation. Rest in peace to the king of pop, Michael Jackson. You guys let me know in the comments and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace, I'm out.